America's relationship with Israel is one of the most consistent and unchanging parts of its foreign policy. Each year, the U.S. provides Israel with billions of dollars in military aid, far more than it gives any other country. No matter which political party is in charge, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, there's one thing that always stays the same. The U.S. gives its full support to Israel.
My thoughts were that we need to support Israel. No ands, ifs, or buts. This was an unprovoked attack by terrorist people willing to kill innocent people to achieve an objective.
The bonds between the United States and Israel are unbreakable, and the commitment of the United States to the security of Israel is ironclad.
So here is my commitment to you on the solemn date. I will not allow the Jewish state to be threatened with destruction. I will not allow another Holocaust of the Jewish people. I will not allow a jihad to be waged on America or our allies. And I will support Israel's right to win its war on terror, and it has to win it fast.
This strong bond between two countries has confused many people around the world, especially when they see America backing Israel through wars, human rights violations, and several controversies. So why? Why does the United States always seem to stand by Israel, no matter what? If you watch the mainstream media, they claim we are two nations sharing similar values. Both of us are democracies, both of us have a lot of cultural ties, and both of us claim to want peace and stability in the Middle East. But if we dig deeper, we'll find out that this is nothing more than a complete lie. In fact, there's a much darker, more disturbing reason behind America's consistent support for Israel. It has less to do with shared values and democracy and more to do with manipulation and power. Before we get into the details behind why America always supports Israel, it's important to understand a little bit about how this relationship started. Israel was created in 1948, but its roots go back even further to the early 1900s. Back then, the land that is now called Israel was known as Palestine, and it was inhabited by a population that was mostly Arab. However, Jewish immigration to Palestine started to increase during this period, largely due to the Zionist movement, which aimed to establish a Jewish homeland in this region. The movement gained even more momentum after the horrors of the Holocaust. After the war, there was a strong push, especially from Jewish groups, to create a safe haven for Jewish people. But creating a new Jewish state in Palestine wasn't as simple as just drawing borders on a map. The land was already home to hundreds of thousands or even millions of Arabs, and they had lived there for generations. Therefore, the United Nations proposed a plan in 1947 to divide Palestine into two states, one for the Jews and one for the Arabs. According to this plan, about 55% of the land was given to the Jewish state, and about 45% was to be allocated for the Arab state. This plan, however, was never implemented as intended because the Arab leaders rejected it, seeing it as unfair and a violation of their rights to the land, while the Jewish leaders accepted it. This led to immediate tensions and ultimately to violence. In 1948, Israel declared itself an independent state, which led to the first Arab-Israeli war. Several Arab countries immediately attacked Israel, but Israel won the war, and as a result, its territory expanded beyond what had been proposed by the United Nations. By the end of the war in 1949, Israel controlled about 77% of the land that had previously been British-mandated Palestine, far more than the 55% originally allocated to them by the UN plan. As a result, many Palestinians were either forced out of this territory or fled with fear. During and after the war, an estimated 700,000 Palestinians either fled or were expelled from their homes, and many of them were never able to return. Israel's territorial expansion during the 1948 war set the stage for decades of conflict between Israel and the Arab world. The Arab countries refused to recognize Israel's existence, and the Palestinians, left stateless, became a central issue in the ongoing Middle East conflict. One of the first countries to recognize Israel after it declared independence in 1948 was the United States. At that time, the US was still coming out of World War II and was beginning to position itself as a global superpower. For the US, supporting the creation of Israel wasn't just sympathy for the Jewish people after the Holocaust. It was also a strategic decision. During the Cold War, which was just beginning around this time, the US was locked in a power struggle with the Soviet Union. Both superpowers were looking for allies around the world, especially in key regions like the Middle East, which was important because of its oil reserves and its location between Europe, Asia, and Africa. Therefore, the US saw Israel as a potential ally in the region, where many countries were leaning toward the Soviet Union. The US provided Israel with advanced weapons, financial aid, and political support, even when Israel's actions were criticized by the international community. This support allowed Israel to expand its territory and solidify its control over the land it had taken during the wars with its Arab neighbors. One of the most important moments in the US-Israel relationship came in 1967 during the Six-Day War. Israel fought against Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, and in just 6 days, it managed to defeat all three countries, taking control of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai Peninsula. This war was a turning point as Israel now controlled much more land than it had before, including areas that were home to large Palestinian populations. The US has tried on occasion to broker peace between Israel and the Palestinians, most notably with the Oslo Accords in the 1990s, but these efforts have largely failed, in part because of America's unwillingness to pressure Israel to make real concessions. Instead, the US has continued to provide Israel with military aid and political support, allowing it to expand settlements and maintain its occupation of Palestinian land. Every US administration since then has continued this support, making sure that Israel remains a powerful military force in the region. One of the most significant reasons behind America's unwavering support for Israel is the role of lobbying, particularly through organizations like APAC, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee. Over the years, APAC has become one of the most powerful and influential lobbying groups in Washington, D.C., and its sole purpose is to ensure that U.S. policy remains strongly aligned with Israel's interests. They just don't send a few lobbyists to Washington, D.C., they organize conferences, engage with politicians, and rally supporters to advocate for pro-Israel legislation. Their goal is to ensure that Israel continues to receive U.S. military aid and political backing regardless of whether the actions of the Israeli government align with broader American interests. Congressman Thomas Massie explained it very well when he was on a podcast with Tucker Carlson.
Well, I have Republicans who come to me on the floor and say, I wish I could vote with you today. Yours is the right vote, but I would just take too much flack back home. And I have Republicans who come to me and say, that's wrong what APAC is doing to you. Let me talk to my APAC person. By the way, everybody but me has an APAC person.
What does that mean, an APAC person?
It's like your babysitter, your APAC babysitter, who is always talking to you for APAC. They're probably a constituent in your district, but they are, firmly embedded in APAC. And
every member has something like this?
I don't know how it works on the Democrat side, but that's how it works on the Republican side. And when they come to D.C., you go have lunch with them, and they've got your cell number, and you have conversations with them. So I've had
that's absolutely crazy.
I've had 4 members of Congress say, "I'll talk to my APAC person," and it's literally what we call them, my APAC guy. I'll talk to my APAC guy and see if I can get him to, dial those ads back.
Why have I never heard this before?
It doesn't benefit anybody. Why would they want to tell their constituents that they've basically got a buddy system with somebody who's representing a foreign country?
APAC's strategy is quite simple. It rewards politicians who support pro-Israel policies and penalizes those who don't. This is done by directing campaign contributions toward pro-Israel candidates and encouraging their large network of donors to withhold funds from politicians who are seen as unfriendly to Israel. Essentially, if you're a member of Congress and you want to stay in office, you have to toe the line on Israel. One of the ways APAC is most effective is through its ability to frame issues in a way that makes it politically difficult for U.S. lawmakers to oppose their agenda. For example, they often present support for Israel as synonymous with being a friend of democracy or a protector of democracy. This rhetoric makes it politically risky for anyone to oppose Israel, as they could be labeled as anti-Israel or anti-Semitic, and many politicians, even those who might personally disagree with some of Israel's policy, still end up supporting pro-Israel legislation, simply because of the cost of opposing APAC is way too high. One of the most troubling aspects of APAC's influence is how it silences critics of Israel in U.S. politics. Politicians who criticize Israeli policies, especially those related to the treatment of Palestinians, often face severe political consequences. APAC and its allies are quick to label these politicians as anti-Israel or even anti-Semitic, even if their criticism is focused on specific policies, rather than just Israel's right to exist. A good example of this is what happened to former President Jimmy Carter. Carter, who brokered the Camp David Accords in 1978 between Israel and Egypt, was one of the most pro-Israel presidents in U.S. history. However, in 2006, Carter published a book titled Palestine, Peace Not Apartheid, in which he criticized Israel's treatment of Palestinians and likened it to apartheid in South Africa. The backlash was swift and intense, with many accusing him of being anti-Israel or worse. Despite his long history of supporting Israel, Carter's criticism of Israeli policy made him a pariah in some circles, demonstrating the cost of speaking out against the powerful pro-Israel lobby. Another more recent example is related to the student protests this year. APAC has been very active in pushing for laws that punish what they call anti-Semitic speech online, especially after the protests at universities this year. These protests erupted in response to the Israeli military's actions in Gaza, which many people around the world, including students, saw as war crimes. In response, APAC has pushed lawmakers to introduce or strengthen laws that would punish certain kinds of speech online. These laws would target anyone who speaks out against Israel in ways that APAC deems to be crossing the line into anti-Semitism. America's support for Israel goes beyond lobbying from pro-Israeli groups. The mainstream media also plays a key role in convincing Americans to support Israel. In the United States, the media tends to portray Israel in a very favorable light. Israel is often shown as a small democratic country just trying to defend itself from violent enemies. On the other hand, Palestinians are frequently portrayed as the aggressors, with little attention given to the conditions in which they live under or the reasons behind their resistance. In the days and weeks following October 7, much of the media focused heavily on the Israeli victims of Hamas's attack. Stories about the kidnapped hostages, including women, children, and the elderly, filled the news, humanizing the Israeli victims and creating a narrative of national trauma and outrage. This focus on suffering of Israeli civilians, while completely understandable, also had the effects of minimalizing or sidelining the suffering of Palestinians under Israeli bombardments in Gaza. Major news outlets like CNN, Fox News, and the New York Times ran extensive features on the Israeli hostages, interviewing their families and covering the Israeli government's efforts to recover them. In contrast, Palestinian civilian deaths, which were mounting rapidly due to Israeli airstrikes, were often mentioned briefly, without the same level of personal stories or humanization. Palestinian deaths were reported in statistics rather than stories. Another clear example of the media's hypocrisy and double standards is the language they use when Israel's involved in military engagements with Hezbollah, Iran, and other entities. The difference in wording reveals a significant bias that shapes public opinion. When groups like Hezbollah or Iran carry out attacks on Israel, the media often uses straightforward and harsh language like Hezbollah attacks Israel or Iran strikes Israel. These headlines make it clear who is the aggressor and immediately frames Israel as the victim of an unprovoked aggression. However, when the situation is reversed, when Israel launches attacks on Lebanon, Iran, or other targets, the language suddenly softens or shifts. Instead of saying Israel attacks Lebanon or Israel bombs Iranian targets, the media frequently uses phrases like Israel retaliates or Israel responds. This subtle shift in language gives the impression that Israel is simply defending itself, acting in response to prior aggression, even if Israel is the one who's initiating the violence or escalating the situation. And just like politicians need to be careful of being too critical of Israel, journalists, editors, and the news are also aware of the consequences of being seen as too critical of Israel. Media outlets that criticize Israeli policies too harshly risk backlash from pro-Israel groups, which could lead to accusations of being anti-Semitic or, most importantly, losing advertising revenue and sponsors. As a result, many media organizations play it safe by sticking to a pro-Israel angle, avoiding stories that might offend powerful lobbyists and their supporters. But the influence on media coverage doesn't come solely from political or financial pressures. There's also a strong religious component at play. One of the key religious forces driving U.S. support for Israel is a belief system known as Christian Zionism. Christian Zionism is rooted in the idea that certain biblical prophecies must be fulfilled before the return of Jesus Christ, and one of those prophecies involves the Jewish people returning to their ancient homeland. This is why when evangelicals were asked what they thought about Israel, 86% responded by saying they have a favorable or positive opinion on Israel. This is much bigger than other Christian groups. Evangelical Christians are one of the most influential voting blocs in the United States, particularly within the Republican Party. Their support for Israel is often a major factor in how they vote and the policies they support. For many evangelicals, Israel isn't just another country. It holds a special place in their faith, and they believe that standing with Israel is a moral and religious obligation. One of the biggest examples of how evangelicals express their strong support for Israel is through large-scale events and conventions organized specifically to promote the U.S.-Israel relationship. One of the most prominent events is the CUFI, Christians United for Israel Summit, which takes place annually in Washington, D.C., and this is one of the largest pro-Israel organizations in the U.S., with millions of members, most of whom are evangelicals. At the CUFI Summit, thousands of evangelicals gather to express their unwavering support for Israel. The event features speeches from high-profile political figures and Israeli leaders, all emphasizing the importance of standing with Israel from both a political and religious perspective. Attendees are encouraged to lobby their representatives in Congress, pushing for pro-Israel policies such as increased military aid or support for Israeli settlement expansion. This religious belief has had a profound impact on U.S. foreign policy. Many American politicians, particularly those on the right, understand that in order to win the support of evangelical voters, they need to take a strong pro-Israel stance. This is why, although both Democrats and Republicans are pro-Israel, many conservative politicians go out of their way to express their unwavering support for Israel, no matter what actions the Israeli government takes.
Let's talk about some of the issues at hand. It's been 18 days since Hamas's surprise attack on Israel. What do you think the U.S.'s role should be in this conflict?
Well, we have two roles to play. The first is to provide Israel resupply, and they're going to need it. And obviously, they'll need a lot more if it becomes a two-front conflict. So if they have a war going on with Hezbollah at the same time as Hamas, that's a very different situation than a Gaza-only situation. The second is support on the international stage, as we've been doing on a bipartisan basis, explaining the reality of the situation. It is great and pleasant. It is unfortunate, but Israel has no choice but to go in and demilitarize Gaza and take apart Hamas's ability to threaten them this way in the foreseeable future. And so I think that support is critical.
And finally, the connection between the U.S. and Israel isn't just about religion, lobbying, and the media. It's also about business, especially when it comes to the military. Behind the scenes, there's another powerful force that plays a major role in keeping U.S. support for Israel strong, and that's the military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex refers to the network of defense contractors, arms manufacturers, and military suppliers who make a lot of money from selling weapons and technology to countries around the world. Israel is one of the biggest recipients of U.S. military aid, receiving billions and billions of dollars each year. This aid comes in many forms, but a large portion of it is spent on weapons and military technology. And the catch is most of this money has to be spent on American-made weapons and equipment. So while the U.S. is technically giving money to Israel, most of it flows right back to American defense contractors who supply Israel with fighter jets, missiles, tanks, and other military equipment. For companies like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Boeing, Israel is an important customer. Every time Israel purchases American-made fighter jets or missile defense systems like the Iron Dome, these companies benefit. This relationship is a win-win. Israel gets the advanced military equipment it needs to maintain its military superiority in the Middle East, and American defense companies gets billions and billions in contracts, boosting their profits and keeping production lines running. Because of this, the military-industrial complex has a direct interest in making sure that U.S. military aid to Israel continues. Every year that aid is approved, it ensures that American defense contractors will continue to make money from their sales to Israel. This is why, just like APAC and other pro-Israel lobbying groups, defense contractors have enormous influence in Washington, D.C. These companies spend millions of dollars on lobbying efforts to make sure that politicians support policies that benefit them. This significant spending underscores how influential the defense industry is in shaping U.S. foreign policy, especially regarding military aid and arms sales to allies like Israel. This is why President Dwight Eisenhower warned us about the military-industrial complex in his farewell speech.
But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
He saw the growing influence of defense contractors and the military over government policy and feared that it would lead to unnecessary conflicts, unchecked power, and a dangerous cycle where profit motives rather than national interests drive decisions about war and peace. Eisenhower understood very well that once the military-industrial complex gained too much influence, it would be difficult to control, leading to a constant push for increased military spending and involvement in global conflicts all over the world. And so ultimately, America's support for Israel isn't about shared values and saving a democratic ally. The truth is a bit more disturbing. It's more about power, money, and political influence. Lobbyists, religious groups, and defense contractors all have a stake in keeping this relationship strong. Regardless of the impact it will have on peace in the Middle East, President Eisenhower warned us about the dangers of the military-industrial complex, and today we see that influence in full force in America's ongoing, unquestioning support for Israel. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching this video until the end. If you found this video informative and interesting, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. I appreciate you watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care. Peace out.